This week, we look ahead to Game Week 2, and with lots of Premier League signings continue to trickle in, lots of us are faced with the same dilemma. Do we pick them up, or do we stick with the players that we trusted on draft day? We'll talk about a few of those decisions in this episode. Welcome back to the Draft FC podcast, the podcast website and YouTube channel dedicated to all things official draft FPL. My name is Mitch and I'm your host for another Game Week preview, going over waiver options, hidden gems, predicted lineups and general Premier League chat ahead of Game Week 2. Now, let's start with an important public service announcement right at the top, because the questions have been trickling in already. And if you peruse any of the draft forums, you'll have seen lots of posts that have a very similar vibe already coming in. So if you're someone that needs to hear this, listen up. After one game week of Premier League football, your good players that you picked up in the early rounds on draft day are still good. Please do not message me about the likes of Gakpo, Darwin Núñez, even Kevin De Bruyne, or whoever else you picked up in the opening 3 rounds that either didn't start at the weekend or didn't amount to much after 90 minutes. A player picked up in the opening few rounds of the draft really is someone we have to judge over 38 game weeks. And if your judgment is such that you don't think they're up to it, really your only realistic option is to try and trade them to a fellow manager. The only reason they end up in the waiver pile is if you're in a very small league or if they break their leg. So just know that trading them after game week 1, their stock will be low, and don't expect to get a fair market price for them if you do manage to trade them to a league rival. If you are the one receiving a trade proposal from a rival manager who is already getting cold feet, just remember now is the time that deals are struck that are too good to be true. It definitely felt like a rusty start for a lot of teams coming back to league football. No team really got out of third gear that much, and that was probably reflected in some of the tighter results. I say, given how the summer's gone with the Euros and lots of players not returning to their teams until just a week or days before the start of Game Week 1, it wasn't surprising to see a lot of them benched or even not in the squads entirely, so we won't really know how teams are shaping up in terms of a strong first choice 11 until next week, or possibly even the week after, and maybe even after the first international break for a few players too. There were a few surprises, though, in lineups, and one particular one we were told about was Injured, who popped up with a vintage goal to earn his team a point last night, none other than Jamie Vardy. Now, I'm recording this episode on Tuesday, the 20th of August, so any team news, injury developments, or press conference information are up to date as of then, and probably subject to change. Some of the players I'll be discussing in this episode include Mazraoui, De Ligt, Evanilson, Jorginho Rutter, plus a few more, so let's get straight into it. So there is no Friday night football this week, so we have a fairly conventional waiver deadline of 11 a.m. BST on Friday the 23rd, with the game week main deadline on 11 a.m. on Saturday. So a little bit more time this week to be able to listen to pods and get your waivers nicely sketched out. Now, last week we didn't have any waivers to talk about because it was before Game Week 1, but we now do have some data for who the players that you were bringing in and dropping last minute before that opening round of fixtures. This is obviously brought to you by the data at Draft FC, which is exclusive to members. All of the data that you hear discussed in these pods are fully available if you are a signed up member. There is nothing secret in there. So if that is something that you'd be interested in having access to, then obviously feel free to check the link below and sign up. So the main players coming in, not a lot of surprises there. A lot of the new faces that we'll talk about a little bit later. De Ligt, Füllkrug, obviously for those of you who drafted quite early in the summer, he wouldn't have been available. Mazraoui, Calafiori, Henderson for Palace, which again, probably not surprising. A lot of managers tweaking that if they maybe picked up Johnson on draft day. Quansah, bad luck there. Smith Rowe and Hall. The players making way, Shaw, Branthwaite with their injury news. Vardy, who we were told about would be injured, but then obviously came in and scored. So bad luck for any of you who dropped him. You know, I probably would have done the same off of that kind of information. Verbruggen dropped for any managers who didn't realise he was injured for a while, and that's probably where all the people bringing in Henderson went. And then Rodri, Reece James, Callum Wilson and Oscar Bob. So pretty much everyone dropping the injured players. So no real shocks or surprises there. In terms of fixtures, I kind of went through a lot of these last week, so I'm not really going to spend a huge amount of time on them. I would say a lot of the teams with good fixture runs remain in the same category as we were talking about last week. Chelsea and Manchester City probably also go into that list, with Wolves and Brighton still not having a particularly good run in the upcoming weeks. Now, there are definitely a few key injuries and a couple more suspensions to talk about this week. Starting with Danilo, now it's probably not a huge one for draft managers, but sustained a nasty-looking ankle fracture, so he'll probably be out until Christmas time, I would imagine, at the earliest. Fabian Schär was sent off straight red for violent conduct, which means he will miss game weeks 2, 3 and 4, so we won't see him again until after the international break. Now, his average draft position was around 70th overall for 8-team leagues, so a lot of you were taking him around 9 as a sort of second or third defender. So I think unless you've ended up with a lot of holes in your squad and you're struggling to field an 11, he's probably somebody that you have to hold, sit him at the back of the bench on the naughty step for a few weeks until he comes back. Ashley Young was the other one sent off, so he's now suspended. It's probably an easy drop. Savio for City did come in and start. It's one of the positions that we were sort of umming and ahhing about at Draft FC when we were predicting the lineups, but he did start. No real news yet on what the nature of the injury was. He kind of did struggle on a bit towards the back end of the first half, but then was substituted at half time. We are expecting Foden probably to come back into the lineup, as we'll discuss later on. So, yeah, if he is injured, then he's obviously a drop too. And the last one just to mention here is Yankuba Minteh, who we discussed on the last pod, was subbed off with through concussion protocol, but apparently there was some sort of miscommunication there and it wasn't a head injury. So as far as I'm aware, he's absolutely fine and good to go for game week 2. So let's talk about some of the main picks then, and we'll also include some of the new signings in this section who, for a few of them don't have any ownership data yet, but it's probably not fair to put them in the hidden gem section. So let's start with some defenders. The first one is Maatsen for Aston Villa, and if you've listened to my pre-season content, you'll have known that I'm a big fan of his, and I think he's going to have a really good season. Ownership levels are strong, but in my opinion, should be stronger. Probably too much to ask for him to go straight into the team for game week 1, but with the limited minutes he got at the end, I think he firmly stakes claim for the left-back spot heading into game week 2, but it is a pretty hard game against Arsenal, where the fixtures really do swing for Villa in game week 3. So in 8-team leagues, he's available in just over 40% of leagues. He's a lot more heavily owned in the bigger leagues. So yeah, if you're in that kind of category, there's definitely going to be a defender I would advocate that you drop in favour of him and would give you a nice head start before their fixture swing next week. Then we come on to the new United defenders that came into the game just before last week's deadline, so they were available to be picked up in the waivers and free agency. Let's start with Mazraoui. He appeals to me way more than De Ligt does. Natural right back, can also cover the left if required. Straight into the starting 11 with Dalot moved over to the left. Did not look like he'd just playing his first game for Man United. Looked very comfortable on the ball. Did his defensive duties well too. And I'd probably expect him to be preferred to Dalot over the course of the season when everyone's fit. So yeah, if I was picking United defender, he's definitely one I would look at. Then we've got De Ligt coming in as another centre-back option. Hopefully means United then don't need to rely on Johnny Evans quite so much, especially not in the Premier League. Now, Maguire had a pretty decent game against Fulham, probably one of the best games I've seen him play for a while, so it would be harsh to drop him. But De Ligt is an Erik Ten Hag man through and through. Ten Hag made him Ajax's youngest ever club captain back in 2018, so De Ligt possibly still a teenager at that point, in a season in which they won the league and the domestic cup double. 50% of me thinks it's too harsh to drop Maguire for this game after how he just performed. The other 50% of me thinks that Ten Hag has no time to lose and will play what he considers to be the strongest 11 regardless of any hurt feelings. But say for 10-team leagues, his ownership has already rocketed to 65%. That's all the United fans paying the United tax. So yeah, I expect in a lot of engaged leagues, they're not even available still to pick up. If you're in a league of 8 teams or less, I think either of these two at the moment would seem unnecessary. Brighton away and then Liverpool in game week 3 hardly screams get a Man United defender in right now, but as I said, enough people in the leagues will pay the United tax to get them in early. On to some midfielder picks, and some of these I'm covering again from last week, starting with Louis Paqueta for West Ham. Obviously mentioned him in pre-season and in the game week 1 preview. Expect him to be picked up in a lot of leagues this week, having started with a goal and confirmation really that he is the West Ham penalty taker when he's on the pitch. Bowen was on the pitch, Kudus was on the pitch, I think Antonio was on the pitch at the time and he was the preferred taker. Always a valuable player to have in draft FPL, having a team's penalty taker. It gives them access to points and goal returns even when they're not having a good game. His ownership did creep up at the weekend, 70% now in 10-team leagues, and I expect that to rise even higher heading into game week 2. Hudson-Odoi, I'm not really going to cover much again, but he's definitely one to consider. His ownership is still below 50% even in 10-team leagues, And with Forest still in their nice opening fixture run, definitely an option if you're looking for someone on a short-term basis in midfield. For Brighton, we've got a few players to talk about. Let's start with Minter, who obviously talked about the injury is not as bad as we thought. Moves out of hidden gem territory this week, and I say before the game week even kicked off, such was the FOMO from leagues in which he'd been skipped over on draft day. Started his Brighton Premier League career with a very fine assist for Matoma on his weaker foot in the first half before then being subbed just before half-time. Now, those 45 minutes put him second only to Trent Alexander-Arnold in terms of expected assists after the first game week, and Trent played well into the second half for his stats. We'll say anyway, he's fit. Next game will be at home to Man United, so we'll have to wait and see how he gets on against some stiffer competition. Next, again, just to briefly mention, ownership is pretty high. 97% in 10-team leagues means he's not an option there, but for 8-team leagues, Matoma's ownership is just 67%, which means he's available in about a third of 8-team leagues, which is crazy to me. Our expected FPL points algorithm puts him on around 4.4 for next week, which is very high. So again, if you're looking for someone short to long-term even, I'd certainly be looking at him long-term. Matoma is an excellent person to grab. And then finishing up with Brighton, we'll talk about their brand new signing, Jorginho Rutter. He seems to be going by Jorginho now, but I still know him as Rutter. Secured his move from Leeds to Brighton for around £40 million. Now, I've always thought of him as a striker. I think he's always lined up as a striker, but he's gone into FPL as a midfielder, which doesn't seem right to me. It would have been nice to have had another option up front, but here we are. He's been more prolific for assists last year than he is scoring goals, which may be just what they need for the system to excel with the likes of Matoma, Minter, who we've just mentioned, João Pedro, to all kind of work nicely with him as a foil in that number 9 position. So I like Rutter as a player. Brighton wouldn't have spent that money if he wasn't going to play. Not somebody that you have to rush out to go and waiver, especially Brighton's tricky upcoming fixtures, but a very interesting wait and see. Then let's talk about some strikers, and there's only one place to start, the name on everybody's lips this week, and that is Bournemouth's brand new Dom Solanke replacement, Evanilson, who has just arrived from Porto. He is in the game, so he's available on waivers for Game Week 2, and I know that many of you will be eyeing up who to trade him out for. Now, Evanilson should be a familiar name, at least for those who maybe caught a bit of the Champions League last season. He did feature for Porto in the 2 legs against Arsenal in the round of 16. He did score 4 goals in their Champions League campaign as a whole last year, although all 4 of those goals were against Royal Antwerp. In the league, it was 13 from 27 appearances with a handful of assists. Did I mention he's Brazilian? Always a good attribute to look out for any budding scouts out there. He should be a good replacement for Solanke, and Iraola will be hoping he can provide goals and also be useful in the link-up play. He doesn't mind receiving the ball with his back to goal. He can really hold it up well. It just really remains to be seen whether he can kind of carry those stats forward and replicate them in the Premier League. Now, as I said, naturally lots of interest in him this week, and I don't blame you. If you ignored the forwards on draft day, then he really should be a priority waiver this week. In terms of those looking to swap out a more established playing forward, let me quickly run through my forward ranking. So obviously we've got Haaland, Watkins, Isak, Havertz, Solanke, Darwin Núñez, Mateta, Gakpo, Füllkrug, Højlund, Cunha, Visser. Would I swap Evanilson for any of those guys? No, I probably wouldn't. Then you've got a whole kind of grey area, a whole batch of strikers. You've got Tony, future very much still up in the air, but odds of staying seem to be decreasing every day, especially following his omission from the GAMEWEEK squad. Nico Jackson, who is his starting spot looks to be more and more doubtful with yet more rivals, and he is a player that I do like. Gabriel Jesus seemingly occupying the same position in the squad as last season, i.e. not in the starting 11. Wood and Awani likely continuing to share minutes, and then you've also got the added risk of a possible move in for Nketiah to Forest. Vardy rolling back the years, but for how long? Richarlison no longer first 11 for Spurs. So would I swap Evanilson for any of these guys? Probably yes. But I wouldn't argue with you if you decided to stick with who you've got from that list. Then the player that nobody quite knows what to do with is Joshua Zirkzee. Now, I own Zirkzee in my main league and, of course, benched him for his opening goal. However, new transfers are embargoed in my league, so it means I personally don't have the option of bringing in Evanilson as we lock down those new players until the transfer window shuts. But if I had the opportunity to swap them, I probably would. Zirkzee has obviously caught some headlines already, But on paper, Evanilson has a far better record than Xerxes and should have far less risk of minutes for Bournemouth, where he should start near enough every week. If both of these players were in the game pre-game week 1, I would have had Evanilson above Xerxes in my rankings, and 1 goal for Xerxes doesn't really change that. It's quite funny, actually, just how hard it is to really rate Xerxes at the moment, and if anything, him scoring the goal has just made it even more of an unknown as to what to do with him. I think everyone was kind of quite content with him sort of filling in a bit and maybe being the number 2 that might get some minutes and the odd goal here and there. Now we're faced with the idea that he could be the main man moving forwards, and no one really knows how to value him. It's hard to get decent trade value. You can't drop him, or it feels like you can't drop him. Then do you even play him in your starting 11? Will he continue to play? Who the hell knows? But yeah, I think if I was in a position in a league where waivers were a free-for-all, which I know will be the case for most of you, I would swap Xerxes for Evanilson. Of course, the ideal scenario is to trade Xerxes, get some upgrade elsewhere, maybe in midfield, maybe get a premium defender, and then waiver out the make-weight forward that you could have received in return. And then the other forward I just wanted to mention here is Eddie Nketiah, who I did just mention. It seems increasingly likely now that he's going to secure a Premier League move this summer, which will obviously only boost his value for draft managers. A fair few of your leagues already saw him drafted, and presumably this was punting on the fact that he could get a move. Sounds like Forest is the most likely landing spot for him for a reasonable wedge of a transfer fee, so maybe worth holding for now, unless you've got the chance to get Evanilson, in which case just get that business done. Now, the other name who lots of people will be talking about this week is João Felix. He's not included in this episode as he's not formally a Chelsea player yet at the time of recording, so will likely be for discussion on next week's pod. If he's not in the game at least 24 hours before the waivers go, he will be locked for this week anyway. So I think it's an easy enough player to kind of appraise, as we have relatively recent data of him playing in the Premier League for the same club. His arrival definitely spells bad news for Nico Jackson drafters, a Premier League player. I did have fairly high on draft day, so we'll have to see how that 11 and that squad ends up looking in a few weeks' time. So let's get into some hidden gems, players with generally less than 10% ownership in 8 to 10 team leagues, starting with some defenders. The Forest guys are all still on there. I'm not going to cover them again. They're away to Southampton this week. 2 interesting names. Livramento started ahead of Trippier for Newcastle in their game at home to Southampton in game week 1. Obviously, that game didn't really pan out in a way that lets us use those stats very reliably because of the sending off to Fabian Schär. But still no move on the horizon, it seems, for Trippier, and bench for that one with Livramento starting. No real attacking chances or underlying stats to talk about for Livramento, but I'll say that's probably more because of the way the game state developed with them down to 10 men. As much as Livramento could be a bargain, obviously this raises question marks for those of you that might have picked up Kieran Trippier on draft day. Now, the majority of people getting Trippier would have got fairly decent value for him, and he would be another one just to wait and see for a couple more weeks, because if you drop him and he ends up staying, he could turn into a really big player for one of your league rivals. And then finally, Rico Lewis, who had a pretty decent game for City away at Chelsea. Ownership did creep up before game week 1, which is reasonable. Currently do have him slated to continue in that starting position in right back, but it's only going to be a matter of time before Walker's back into the team. In terms of midfielder options, Brereton Diaz is definitely one worth looking at. As much as Forest have a nice game, you could also flip it to Southampton and say they've got a nice game against Forest. Semenyo for Bournemouth, his value is interesting now. I suspect he still gets into the 11, but he's not going to be the number 9 as he was in game week 1. But definitely a player I like the look of. His ownership went up to 39% in 10-team leagues before that game. Tricky game this week with Newcastle at home, but still a player I like the look of. And I think if you're in a 10-team league, definitely good enough to be in your top 40 midfielders. And then the last one, which is really just one to keep an eye on, not one I'm advocating for strongly, is Onana for Villa. Got his goal. Very low ownership regardless of league size. Tough game this week at home to Arsenal before the fixture run turns nicely. I think it's going to be interesting as we reacquaint ourselves with Onana this season. He's not going to be the same player that we've seen for Everton over the last couple of years. It can be more similar, I think, to the Onana that we see in a Belgium shirt, which means he will get forward more and potentially unlocks more attacking returns for him, but we can wait and see. And then one forward to talk about in Hidden Gem territory is Duran for Aston Villa. I think Hidden Gem territory is still where he belongs. He's definitely not one that you want to grab if you're in an 8-team league, for example, but he definitely has value in larger leagues. So don't be surprised if we see Watkins and Duran lining up together at times this season. It only takes an injury to a Rodgers or a Bailey, for example, and I think they have to consider doing that. So, say ownership's pretty high in 10-team leagues, 46%. I think that's about right. And I would just continue to hold over the next couple of weeks to see how his position develops. But he would be somebody who I would very much drop for Evanilson if that opportunity was there. And then this week's most hidden gem picks. This is a player owned in less than 10% of 16-team leagues. Now, I still could and probably should have picked Milenkovic in this spot for Forest as he remains eligible. But, I prefer a more fun pick. And here, really, we are going to tread the line between fun and utterly infuriating. Yep, it is Adama Traore for Fulham. Absolutely gassed Martinez early in that opening game before then very swiftly falling into Martinez's pocket as the game went on. I think there's a good chance he continues to start due to the lack of other options, really, in that Fulham squad. So ownership is just 5% in 16-team leagues. Next fixture is Leicester at home. And if he's going to get joy in any game in the season, this is the type of game it could be. And then another segment that I will do as we go through the season really is a get-rid list, which is just players that I think probably need to be dropped week to week. On the list this week, some of the key names are Quansah for Liverpool, subbed at half-time due to poor performance, confirmed by Slot, which doesn't bode well for his starting position. Moving forwards, Raheem Sterling seems to be on his way out the door somehow at Chelsea if he agrees to tear up a $325,000 a week contract. Ivan Toney would definitely be looking to move on. I say the fact that he wasn't even on the bench for Brentford due to transfer speculation does not bode well. And Ashley Young, if you somehow ended up with him for Game Week 1, needs to go too. So let's talk through some of the predicted lineups for Game Week 2. Now, aware last week this section probably went on a little bit too long, so I'm going to try and be a bit quicker and more succinct with it, moving forwards and just highlight the ones that I feel are important. So here I have brought up the Draft FC predicted lineups, which are available to all. If you just search Draft FC Premier League predicted lineups into Google or click the link below, you will be able to find those. I say they're freely available to everyone, regardless of whether you are a member or not. So for Arsenal, I've got a sneaky suspicion we see Timber come in at left back over Zinchenko, but it could easily be Zinchenko carrying on there to give him a bit more of a rest. For Aston Villa, I say apart from Maatsen coming in, I don't see much change there. Bournemouth, I would expect Semenyo to line up as number 9 with Evanilson possibly coming off the bench. It depends really how well he's slotted into things in training this week. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if he did start as a number 9 straight in the same way Solanke did for Spurs. For Brentford, they could very easily be an unchanged 11 away in Anfield. Same for Brighton. I've currently got them lined up exactly as they did in that first game. But again, Welbeck could be swapped out for Rutter, but I probably think it's more likely that Rutter comes on as a substitute in this game and then potentially starts in Game Week 3. Chelsea, again, who the hell knows? We saw Dewsbury Hall come off the bench. We saw Neto come off the bench in that game against City. I've got Neto to start this one. I've got Dewsbury Hall to start this one, with potentially Nico Jackson missing out and Nkunku playing as a kind of a false 9 and Palmer off the right. Chelsea started with Enzo Fernandez, Caicedo and Lavia in Game Week 1, which is probably more just because of the fact that they were playing Manchester City. I think moving forward, one of those 3 players will drop out. And I've currently got Lavia missing out there, but there's just so much turmoil in that squad. It's hard to know how things are going to settle down. Mateta came straight in, which is a little bit of a surprise. I think lots of people were expecting Edouard to start that one, but it was Mateta straight in, so I don't see much changing to the Palace lineup. Then to Everton, and they've got a real headache at the back. So Branthwaite's injured, Young's now suspended, Patterson's injured, Coleman's injured, and Michael Keane is crap. So they've got real trouble there. As it stands, just for pure needs must, I've got Holgate starting as a right back with Keane continuing to play at centre back, and the rest will probably stay largely the same. But yeah, the way Keane defended those 2 late goals for Brighton really did make the scoreline look a lot more flattering than it should have done. For Fulham, I think they'll line up pretty much the same. The only surprise for me was Castagna being left out for Tete. I thought Tete had a pretty good game. He was involved a lot, but I wouldn't be surprised if Castagna randomly just came back for this one. For Ipswich, my main surprise was seeing Tuanzebe play instead of Ben Johnson. Now, for this game, their hardest game of the season away at Manchester City, I've got them playing some sort of hybrid system which involves Tuanzebe and Johnson being on the pitch at the same time. So I think out of possession, Tuanzebe will just fill in as a right centre-back and Johnson will tuck in as a right wing-back. And then in position, I think Johnson could then move further forwards or invert, create more of a 4-3-3 on the ball and a sort of a 5-4-1 off the ball. Pure speculation though, but that's just what I feel that they will do. As I said, with the hardest game of the season. Leicester, I think, will line up very similarly. Same with Liverpool, other than Konate stepping in for Quansah. City, they have got a couple of problems now. Obviously, Grealish was already injured. Savio now looks like he could be injured, but Foden's back. Rodrigo should be fit as well. The only question mark really there is whether there's any juggling of the defenders. For United, I've got Xerxes to start up top. Amad Diallo dropping out of the team. I've got Mazraoui playing at right back again and Diallo left back, although if Shaw's fit, he would come back in there. Currently sticking with Martinez and Maguire, but I'll see how I feel or if there's any comments that come out this week to suggest that De Ligt goes straight in there alongside Martinez. Newcastle should line up very much the same. The same with Nottingham Forest, apart from Danilo being replaced by Yates. Southampton should be pretty much the same. Spurs, there's a slight injury concern over Pedro Porro. We'll have to wait and see what the news is there. Bentancur also will probably miss the weekend through some capacity due to his head injury, which is fine because Bissouma was only suspended for game week 1 and was probably going to come in for game week 2 anyway. Johnson had a pretty frustrating game on the right wing, so I expect Kulusevski to start this one, with Johnson potentially coming off the bench later on. For West Ham, I think we do see a couple of their new signings entering the starting 11 for the first time. Fulkrug, I think, will start at number 9. I think Tadaibo will come in at centre-back. The only other question is whether Wan-Bissaka comes in instead of Kufal, but they may think that's too many changes to make all at once. But he'll be in the team sooner rather than later, I'm sure. And for Wolves, I expect them to line up pretty much as they did last weekend too. So that is it for this episode. A reminder that the waivers will process on Friday morning at their usual time of 11 o'clock British summertime. Now, if you've got this far into the podcast, I'm going to assume that you are a dedicated and committed draft FPL manager, in which case, please click the subscribe button if you haven't already so you don't miss out on any future episodes as they drop. And if you're listening to the audio, hit the follow button so you don't miss out on whichever podcast aggregator you use as soon as a new episode drops. Also, if you find it useful, click the thumbs up button. That helps get the video out there too. And check out our social media channels. All the links are in the description below. Follow us on there. And this is also the easiest place to message us should you have any questions about your team, moves, or the website. And on that note, I should probably warn you now that heading into this weekend, it's probably going to be one of the least responsive weeks we have on the DMs. So do not fret if we do not reply in our usual swift manner that you're used to. There is a big weekend of festivities coming up because Draft FC Taz, who many of you will have interacted with in the DMs too, is getting married. And for those of you that haven't been acquainted with Draft FC Taz, all I would say is if you consider me the voice and face of Draft FC Taz is the beating heart. He is the one that has created the whole website from scratch, deals with any technical issues that people might have, and continues to build excellent resources for me, you, and everyone to enjoy. So for this weekend at least, the guys here at Draft FC will have our eye on far more important matters than the football. So I'm sure you can join us all in wishing Draft FC Taz a great weekend and of course a very long and happy future with soon to be Mrs. Draft FC Taz. And until next time, stay sure.